Hello. Did not dress up today. Today I'm reading instead of leaving this world. Alright, halfway through chapter 4. As bears repeating, all human beings are existentially challenged to handle disappointing shifts out of thriving into surviving. We survivors, however, have greater difficulties handling these transitions because we were abandoned for so long at the surviving end of the continuum. Yet, as our recovery progresses, we can learn to become increasingly self-supportive in times of being stuck in survival. Difficulties in identifying the signs of recovery. Some readers may work on their recovery for a long time and erroneously and shamefully feel they are not making any progress. Because of the all-or-none thinking that typically accompanies CPTSD, survivors in early stages of recovery often fail to notice or validate their own actual progress. If we do not notice the degrees of our own improvement in our recovery work, we are in great danger of giving up on recovering. Because of black and white thinking, we can regularly fall into the trap of not acknowledging and valuing what we are actually accomplishing. Perfectionist dismissal of improvement that is not 100% is common in early recovery. Here are some common areas where I see that recovering survivors fail to notice and self-validate their progressive degrees of improvement. 1. Less intense launching into 4F response. 2. Increasing resistance to the critic. 3. Increased mindfulness about flashbacks or inner critic attacks. 4. Increased time feeling good enough about yourself. 5. Progress in meeting arrested developments listed in Chapter 2. 6. Decreased overeating or use of self-medicating substances. 7. Increased experiences of good enough relating with each other. 8. Decrease in painfulness and intensity of flashback feelings. In terms of number 3 above, it is important to note that even when mindfulness does not immediately terminate a flashback or a critic attack, noticing and identifying these CPTSD phenomena is more progressive than just being blindly lost in them. Moreover, ongoing recognition makes effective ameliorative action more accessible. It makes us increasingly likely to remember to use the flashback management steps listed in Chapter 8. Furthermore, it is important that we notice the gradually decreasing intensity of flashback feelings of anxiety, shame, and depression. In this regard, social anxiety can gradually reduce along a continuum that stretches from panicking, withdrawal, to a more tolerable social discomfort, to periods of social ease. Additionally, depression can gradually diminish along a continuum that stretches from paralyzing despair to anhedonia, an inability to enjoy normal life pleasures, to a state of tired and relatively unmotivated peacefulness. Of course, both of these processes typically improve at a vacillating back and forth rate. As I write this, I feel some old sadness about my many decades that I judged my emotional tone and mood as either good or bad in a very all or nothing way. If I was not feeling very good, then I felt as if everything was really bad. And since feeling very good is something most human beings only get to experience a relatively small portion of the time, my perception of feeling bad became a much more dominant experience than was necessary. In fact, mildly unpleasant feelings typically morphed me quickly into feeling terrible via shame-tinged all-or-nothing thinking. I'm so grateful for the life-changing epiphany that led me to trade in my old primary aspiration of celebration for my new one of serenity. Inner critic thought processes refute signs of progress whenever a new flashback occurs, no matter how much less intense it is than before. Every recurrence of feeling shame, fear, or depression is interpreted as proof that nothing has changed, even when there are increasing periods of not being triggered. The critic's black and white assessment is either I'm cured or I'm still hopelessly defective. And once you identify with your critic's pronouncement of defectiveness, you are off and spiraling downwards into a full-fledged flashback. Captured once again in the ice veneer of toxic shame that freezes into one in the CPTSD stranglehold of helplessness and hopelessness. Attempting recovery is a lifelong process. It is increasingly difficult to accept the proposition, the fact that recovery is never complete. And although we can expect our flashbacks to markedly decrease over time, it is tremendously difficult and sometimes impossible to let go of the salvation fantasy that we will one day be forever free of them. Yet when we do not loosen our grip on the salvation fantasy, we remain extremely susceptible to blaming ourselves every time we have a flashback. Understanding this is crucial because recovery typically progresses in a process that has many temporary regressions. Moreover, most recoveries often have the unfortunate subjective experience that the temporary regression feels as permanent as concrete. This is especially true because of the interminability feeling of flashbacks. When we flash back, we regress to our child mind, which was incapable of imagining a future any different than the everlasting present of being so abandoned. So how can we come to bear the knowledge that our awful childhoods have created some permanent damage? It helps me to see my CPTSD as somewhat analogous to diabetes, a condition that will need management throughout my life. This is a piece of bad news that naturally feels offensively unpalatable. But the good news, as with diabetes, is that we become more skilled at flashback management. CPTSD can gradually become infrequently bothersome, and even more importantly, we can evolve towards leading increasingly rich and rewarding lives. Even better news is that CPTSD, when efficiently managed, eventually bestows gifts. It comes with significant silver linings, unavailable to those less traumatized, as we will see at the end of this chapter. Therapeutic flashbacks and growing pains. Healing from childhood trauma is also a long, gradual process because recovering your full self-expression requires a great deal of practice. Being yourself can be intimidating and flashback-inducing. Healthy self-assertion was punished like a capital crime in many dysfunctional families. Expressing yourself in ways that your parents forbade typically triggers intense flashbacks at first. This can cause you to lose sight of how this practice gradually reduces the chronic pain of remaining invisible. We can encourage ourselves to face these growing pains by conceptualizing them as therapeutic flashbacks. We then choose to weather these flashbacks to stop the past from holding us back, to reclaim the fundamental human rights that our parents denied us, and to finally own what is rightfully ours for the taking. We can further bolster ourselves for such necessary flashbacks by comparing speaking up to going to the dentist for a toothache. Unless we accept the acute pain of the dentist's therapeutic procedure, we will suffer chronic dental discomfort indefinitely. Unless we speak up, the loneliness of our silence will imprison us forever. Recovering from overwhelmingly painful childhoods is also so difficult because we understandably want to avoid any further pain at all. We may even believe that we need to risk a flashback and practice speaking up. But at the moment of facing the triggering that silence can so easily avoid, we cannot sometimes help giving up and remaining mute. However, if we are ever to recover our real voice, we must sometimes invoke the energy of bravery. Bravery is, in my opinion, defined by fear, It is taking right action despite being afraid. It is not brave to do things that are not scary. The anger work described in Chapter 12 can help you with this enormously. With a strong enough intention, you can begin by occasionally invoking the kind of courage that involves feeling the fear and doing it anyways. You can nudge yourself to do it to rescue your inner child from the loneliness of never being seen or heard. Moreover, when we embrace this practice, we will eventually learn that fear does not have to be disabling. We can be afraid and still act powerfully. We can refuse to tolerate never speaking up, never having our say, never stating a preference, and never saying no to set a boundary. With enough practice, therapeutic flashbacks not only diminish, but begin to replace a healthy sense of pride in ourselves for our courageous self-championing. More and more we are rewarded with feeling a safe belonging in the world. It is crucial for deeper level recovery that we learn that feelings of fear, shame, and guilt are sometimes signs that we have said or done the right thing. They are emotional flashbacks to how we were traumatized for learning to claim normal human privileges. As our recovery progresses, we need to learn to endure these feelings. Reinterpreting the deeper meanings of these feelings is key to accomplishing this. Typically, this involves epiphanies like the following. I feel afraid now, but I'm not in danger like I was as a child. I feel guilty not because I'm guilty, but because I was intimidated into feeling guilty for expressing my opinions, my needs, and my preferences. I feel shame because my parents rained disgust on me for being. I say no to these toxic parental curses, and I am proud and right to see how they tried to murder my soul. I give them their shame back as disgust, the disgust any healthy adult feels when he sees a parent bullying a child with contempt, or when he sees a parent heartlessly ignoring a suffering child. Optimal stress. The quest to ongoingly grow and evolve out of my childhood trauma sometimes becomes more embraceable to me when I remember the poet's words. He's not busy being born, is busy dying. In fact, some of the latest research in neuroscience suggests that we actually need a modicum of stress in our life. This type of stress is called optimal stress. Optimal stress is the balanced, moderate amount of stress that appears to be necessary to grow the neurons and neuronal connections that correlate with keeping the brain healthy. Research shows that just too much stress creates a biochemical condition that damages neurons in the brain. Too little stress leads to the atrophy, death, and lack of replacement of old neurons. This is why lifelong learning is widely recognized as one of the key practices necessary to avoiding Alzheimer's disease. In my opinion, lifelong recovery is an exalted subset of lifelong learning. I believe that optimal stress is frequently attained when we practice the behaviors that remedy our developmental arrests. Examples of this include reading self-help books, attending self-improvement workshops, working at deeper self-discovery through journaling, or struggling to be more vulnerable and authentic in a therapy session or an evolving relationship. Moreover, it might be that minor flashbacks sometimes function as optimal stress. I certainly know of a number of long-term recoveries who seem to be evolving and becoming sharp in their old age. Silver linings. We live in an emotionally impoverished culture, and those who stick with long-term recovery processes are often rewarded with emotional intelligence far beyond the norm. This is somewhat paradoxical, as survivors of childhood trauma are initially injured more grievously in their emotional natures than those in the general population. The silver lining in this, however, is that many of us were forced to consciously address our suffering because our wounding was so much more severe. Those who work on effective recovery program not only recover significantly from emotional damage, but also evolve out of the emotional impoverishment of the general society. One of my clients described this as becoming way more emotionally intelligent than the normies. Perhaps the greatest reward of improved emotional intelligence is seen in a greater capacity for deeper intimacy. Emotional intelligence is a foundational ingredient of relational intelligence, a type of intelligence that is also frequently diminished in the general populace. As stated earlier, intimacy is greatly enhanced when two people dialogue about all aspects of their experience. This is especially true when they transcend taboos against full emotional communication. Feelings of love, appreciation, and gratitude are naturally enhanced when we reciprocally show our full selves. Confident or afraid, loving or alienated, proud or embarrassed. What an incredible achievement it is. What an incredible achievement it is when any two of us create such an authentic and supportive relationship. Many of the most intimate relationships that I have seen are between people who have done a great deal of freeing themselves from negative legacies of their upbringings. The unexamined life is not worth living. A further silver lining in recovery is the attainment of a much richer internal life. The introspective process, so fundamental to effective recovery work, eventually deepens and enriches survivors' psyches. Ongoing mindful exploration of all aspects of our experience helps us see firsthand what Socrates meant when he said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The survivor who follows the introspective road less traveled becomes increasingly free of compulsive and unconscious allegiance to unhelpful familial, religious, and societal values that were instilled at an impressionable age. The recovery now gets to choose her own values and reject those that are not in her own best interest. She develops a deeper, more grounded self-respect that is not contingent upon going with the herd and shifting center with the very new popular trend. In psychological parlance, she becomes free and brave enough to individuate and develop more of her full potential. In Joseph Campbell's words, the survivor learns to follow his own bliss. He is freer to pursue activities and interests that naturally appeal to him. He evolves into his own sense of style. He may even feel emboldened to coif and dress himself without adherence to the standards of fashion. He may extend this freedom into his home decor. In this vein, I have seen many survivors discover their own aesthetic, as well as an increased appreciation of beauty in general. How this contrasts with many of the homes of my normal sports buddies, whose homes are often sparsely decorated, as if they are too afraid to put something up or out, lest it not be cool enough. As the survivor recovers the right to free choice, she becomes more open to trying new things, healthy things that mainstream society might consider uncool or even taboo. Here are some examples of this that I believe are conducive to both recovery and healthy everyday living. Voluntary simplicity, improved diet, meditation, alternative medicine, broad-scale compassion, environmentalism, deeper emotional communication, and broader use of the grieving process. The survivor who pursues long-term development on his journey of recovering generally achieves greater overall evolution than the average citizen. For many untraumatized people, the pursuit of ongoing learning often stops after their last formal learning experience, whether that is high school or college. Introspective development also rewards the recovery with more perspective and wisdom in making important life choices. It also improves his everyday instinctual choices, which as whether to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn in times of real danger. Finally, another silver lining often achieved in later stage recovery is a greater ability to handle normal pain in the most healthy and least re-traumatizing way. By normal pain, I mean the reoccurring existential pain all human beings experience from time to time via encounters with loss, illness, money troubles, time pressures, etc. Such painful encounters can produce emotional reactions like anger, sadness, fear, and depression. The average person has not learned how to verbally ventilate and metabolize their feelings about such events. This results in them getting stuck in painful emotional places, especially depression, for inordinate amounts of time. The emotional imperialism of don't worry, be happy. One reason that recovering survivors attain great emotional intelligence is that they eventually see through the mainstream media's indoctrination that people should be happy all the time. Much of the general populace, however, becomes increasingly disassociated from their full emotional experience by anxiously pushing to pump up their mood. Many normal people strive to fulfill the pursuit of happiness as if it were a patriotic duty. More and more they employ socially acceptable addictions to accomplish this. Snacking, spending, self-medicating, and online puttering are widespread addictions that seem to be ever on their eyes. A particularly rampant example of unhealthy mood-altering behavior is porn addiction. Addiction to pornography creates a terrible narrowing of consciousness in the many men who are afflicted with it. It commonly destroys their capacity for real intimacy. Tragically, the use of porn is more and more normalized, even in many psychological circles. Here are two enlightening references on the subject matter. As we become more emotionally intelligent, we free ourselves from the hysteria-inducing pressures of continuously pump up the joy in our life. Please do not read this as an ode against joy. It is a blessing to have our natural fair share of laughter and feeling good. But I believe it is also a blessing to resist the growing emotional imperialism that demands we become fountains of joy. We are assaulted daily with messages for advertisements from laugh track saturated TV shows and from New Age enlightenment gurus who shame us into believing that we are less than. If we are not constantly bubbling over with ecstatic Disneyland-like enthusiasm. The pressure to always be up with an enormous shame trigger for me for decades. The pressure to be always up was an enormous shame trigger for me for decades. Sadly, I increasingly see clients and friends struggling with self-content for not being happy enough. Once again, I am certainly not knocking joy, but when it is inauthentic, it is disconcertingly sad and sometimes alienating. In worst-case scenarios, a controlling narcissist can emotionally blackmail us to join him in falsely emoting joy, just as painful as when we codependently force ourselves to laugh to cover up fear or shame. This is also not to say that authentic joy cannot be contagious. Contagious joy is a wonderful experience of being positively triggered into vicariously sharing someone else's authentic delight. In my experience, it seems that authentic joy is much more common in the lives of well-parented children. I also do not think that joy is typically as dominant an emotional theme in adult life unless it is synthetically induced with drugs or alcohol. On the other hand, experiences of joy for survivors can gradually become more frequent as a parent's recovery efforts promote increasing feelings of safety in the world. As our emotional intelligence increases, I see considerable evidence that our expectations of joy become more reasonable. This allows us to let go of permanent happiness as the unrealistic goal of recovery. Until this happens, we remain at the mercy of the critic's contemptuous diatribes that we are not being joyful enough. One of my clients recently became mindful enough to see how he was shaming himself for not being as jubilant as those in the beer commercials. As a concluding comment to this overview, it is important to emphasize that, like most things in life, there are degrees of CPTSD. The continuum of CPTSD ranges from mild neurosis to psychosis, and from highly functioning to not functioning. Its severity ranges from having extended periods without flashbacks to being in a full flashback horror much of the time. This range also varies from a condition of increased experiences of thriving to a condition of barely surviving disability. Progress in recovery is seen then in flashbacks becoming more manageable and life satisfaction becoming continuously more frequent. A friend once joked with me I've got so much recovery, I'm beyond normal. I'm super normal. I make the normies look like they're the ones with CPTSD. As we end the overview, we are ready to move to the next chapter, which explains how varying childhood trauma histories can cause CPTSD. Here we will also see how verbal and emotional abuse alone can cause CPTSD and how profound emotional abandonment is typically the core of most CPTSD. Part 2, the fine points of recovering. Chapter 5, what if I was never hit? Physical and sexual abuse are the most obvious traumas that a child can experience, especially when they are ongoing. However, much that is also traumatic goes unnoticed in CPTSD engendering families. This often occurs because parental acts of physical abuse are more blatant than acts of verbal or emotional abuse and neglect. It appears to me that just as many children acquire CPTSD from emotionally traumatizing families as from physically traumatizing ones. Denial about the traumatic effects of childhood abandonment can seriously hamper your ability to recover. In childhood, ongoing emotional neglect typically creates overwhelming feelings of fear, shame, and emptiness. As an adult survivor, you may continuously flash back